History tells empires are born, they expand, they wither away, and sometimes are reborn. The USA appeared just 250 years ago as a rebellious colony, only to become the most powerful country on Earth today. Russia has been at the heart of 3 imperial countries over the past century and a half, while China, after fully collapsing in the 19th and early 20th century, consolidated back into a new empire that is today competing for global hegemony. Decades after the continent-spanning European colonial empires disintegrated, could it be that another European empire is taking its place in the shape of the European Union? Well, faced with outside pressure from other countries, the institutions of the European Union are increasingly looking like and behaving like those of an empire.
I do think that Europe has to become a superpower so that it is taken seriously in the global stage.
That would be a game changer, because the EU has long been written off as a potential global power because since its start it has been politically divided.
Europe will be an economic force. It will not be a strategic, political or military force because they can't get together.
Brussels, with decades of accumulated authority, has turned into a place not where European countries come together to make decisions, but a power center in its own right.
Europe has to learn to become a geopolitical power.
This must be Europe's independence moment.
This is Europe's moment. We are in an era of rearmament.
The institutions of the European Union are shifting to majoritarian rule, giving EU politicians more wiggle room to craft joint policies. And the direction of travel is now unmistakable. The EU's power is growing. It plays a bigger and bigger role in the internal politics of its member states, enforcing its own vision of how the world should be, including on the capitals that resist. And despite its reluctant members trying to keep the lid on the EU's power, external threats are pushing the EU closer together. It seems possible that an empire is now slowly emerging, not from ambition, but as a response to threats it would not otherwise survive. So, has the EU breached its empire containment, and is it now on the road to becoming an empire and a great power in its own right? Well, here's the thing. The EU was specifically designed not to be an empire. After centuries of European countries trying to dominate their neighbors, the founding fathers of the EU built a system that would stop any one power center in the European Union from dominating the others. Instead of war, differences were resolved through negotiation and democracy. It created a system where European countries could resolve their differences peacefully, and basically couldn't go to war with one another. The core principle was a political philosophy called functionalism, and later neo-functionalism. Basically, it meant binding countries together so tightly through trade that breaking apart became structurally impossible, and that one day out of this collaboration, a common European identity would emerge. So the EU was initially a small set of rules that regulated these bonds between countries, and a democratic body to settle disputes. While this expanded over time, encompassing more and more aspects as the bond between countries became deeper, that initial logic remained the same: regulate interactions between countries without intervening too much in their other affairs. But that initial philosophy has left the EU fragmented and divided. Many of the policy items that would be needed for it to become an empire, even smaller pieces of legislation, like tax policy, cross into the domain of national sovereignty. Recently, EU Inc. showcased the limits of its model. It was supposed to be a 28th regime, a single federal corporate framework that would let any European company incorporate as a European identity rather than a national one to standardize rules. Simple enough, right? Well, that is until you start asking questions about who taxes those companies and who has authority over them. And so what landed instead was 27 pieces of fragmented legislation with companies still registered nationally, with some harmonization, leaving most people disappointed and not tackling the initial problems it was meant to solve. That's because the decision-making power still rests with individual countries, which limits the scope and effectiveness of what the EU can actually do. Unlike actual empires, like the United States, China, or Russia, the EU has very few ways to force its constituent subunits to stick together and act as one. You see, empires use carrots and sticks to punish and reward their constituent parts. There are many different carrots and different sticks. There's the military, there's legal and bureaucratic means, there's financial patronage system, and ideological frameworks. The ideological framework will tell the population what to believe, the legal framework will tell you what your responsibilities are and what you have to do, the financial tool will give you rewards through a financial system to make sure you stay happy and on board, and finally the military will protect you from enemies, but also try to put down rebellions if you, for example, try to leave the empire. Now, carrots and sticks don't mean your country is a democracy or a dictatorship, since both systems use carrots and sticks, but they just do it in different ways.
We do not think that it has to be something like a draconian and autocratic organization. It can be democratic, but at the same time, it can be powerful, and part of its power can be to project the values of democracy that it takes very seriously when it comes to the EU institutions and when it comes to the member states as well.
Empires like the United States, China, and Russia have lots of carrots and sticks to go around. The United States, for example, is a federal system. It gives states autonomy, but the commander-in-chief is the president. The federal government has tax-raising abilities to fund a bureaucracy and agencies whose standards apply to the whole country. And its federal legal system to which everybody is accountable, which firmly puts the federal government at the top. The Chinese system is a little bit different. It's a stronger unitary state where everybody is accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. It has a centralized tax system, meaning that no rival power centers can emerge. Russia is different again. It has a strong centralized security service, as well as a personal patronage system where regional power centers and power brokers pledge their fealty to the central government and to the men at the top, Vladimir Putin. But the EU is different. It isn't an empire, and a lot of the sticks and carrots are in the national capitals. It has no military to enforce its will directly, its budget is small, it doesn't raise its own taxes, and it has a limited say on ideology, where it does not control schools, media companies directly. And it can't take many decisions without unanimity from its member states, putting the EU in many cases below the member states in terms of power dynamics. But that hasn't stopped the EU from becoming more powerful over the past decades. Through successive crises, the EU has undergone empire creep and slowly gathered more carrots and sticks. The EU's institutions have asserted themselves the most in the legal dimension. Very early on in the EU's history, EU law became accepted in national courts and placed above national law through landmark court cases. The extension of qualified majority voting at every successive treaty round through the Single European Act, the Maastricht, Amsterdam and Nice and Lisbon Treaty has expanded the list of policy areas decided by a majority rather than unanimity, eroding the national veto. But of course keeping red lines with unanimity for foreign and security policy, defense, taxation, the EU's own resources, and treaty change. The move to the euro, the financial crisis, and the Greek euro crisis in 2015 saw the EU get new powers to inspect national budgets before national parliaments, and important budgetary rules like the Stability and Growth Pact, instauring a debt and deficit rule. While that rule is mostly ignored, it does give the EU negotiating power to deal with members on a per-case basis. There have also been some small moves on the military dimension with the growth of Frontex, the EU's border force, which is basically an embryonic army, and for ideology through cultural initiatives backed by the EU, but also through continent-wide media monitoring mandated by the European Digital Services Act. In fact, recent crises and international pressure have given the EU even more sticks to play with. The Green Deal and the reaction to the US's Inflation Reduction Act means the EU now coordinates industrial policy. COVID exposed supply chain dependence and justified the first ever common debt. Russia's war broke the energy model of the EU and opened the door to joint defense procurement, loosened state aid rules, and opened the door for another 90 billion euros in common borrowing for Ukraine. US threats against Denmark and Greenland have seen a push for more European defense procurement to the loss of the US, coordinated in part by the EU. And to deal with individual member states' vetoes on key policies, it has pursued a so-called multi-speed Europe, with enhanced cooperations becoming the norm to operate. But even without new initiatives, the EU's existing carrots and sticks, especially the economic and political ones, are starting to be worth a lot more, because the EU has turned into a continent of rule breakers. Rules that were agreed by all of the EU countries to avoid any one of them drifting too far off financially or far away from the EU's ideas of a liberal democracy, gave the EU institutions the power to intervene to suspend voting rights or payments to individual countries. Southern Europe was particularly targeted by the terms of the financial rules, while Central and Eastern European countries in terms of the rule of law mechanisms. For net recipients of EU money, the EU budget represents 2 to 3% of GDP. They can defy on small things, but not sustainably on big things. The EU core, with France and Germany, historically has been doing quite well, and they were relatively immune from many of the EU's rules because their economies were larger and stronger, and they have significantly more voting power, meaning the EU's threats had little effect on them. But today, even Germany, which was a beacon of stability and sound public finances, is seeming a lot less immune to the EU sticks. In fact, Germany's government deficit jumped to roughly 4.75% of GDP in 2026, comfortably above the EU's 3% ceiling, largely because of higher defense spending and as part of a rearmament campaign for Russia and to fight deindustrialization. This puts it at risk of an excessive deficit procedure by the European Union for the first time. Currently, only the Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, and Denmark have the same public finances and are net contributors to the EU. But with aging populations, high energy prices, overregulation, and competition from China in many key economic sectors, many European countries are likely to face additional economic struggles in the future, exposing them to the EU's sticks in the form of the excessive deficit procedure, and carrots because the EU has to allow member states to give support to their economy in the form of state aid. Politically, we've also seen the birth of EU patronage networks, and even punitive measures against ideologically non-compliant politicians. For example, the EU threatened to withdraw Italy's COVID bailout funding until Giorgia Meloni adopted a more pro-EU tone. This has even been used to push ideology, with EU's corruption and rule of law probes aimed mainly at nationalist candidates and politicians across the EU, while neglecting similar violations in countries like socialist and pro-EU Spain, which have equally pressing media freedom and judicial reforms. Now, this accumulation of power hasn't been without pushback. There have been notable court cases in Germany pushing back against joint EU bonds, or in Poland against the primacy of EU law. Both of those rulings have been cited by member state governments looking for cover when they want to push back against Brussels. The legal and bureaucratic tool is the tallest pillar the EU has built and the one the most under attack. But at the same time, policies like EU Inc. are still failing to centralize power, and member states like the Frugal Four are trying to prevent the EU from raising its own taxes. But even then, the pushback is far more limited today, especially since Brexit, when even sovereignist politicians know they can no longer credibly call for exiting the EU. And so now EU countries are in the same boat, where more legislation gets passed at the EU level, giving the EU ever more carrots and sticks to tell them what to do. So will the EU actually finish the job and become an empire? Well, here it's perhaps best to look at how the EU has applied its newfound leverage on what was formerly its most troublesome member, Hungary. Under Viktor Orban, Hungary created an illiberal democracy. Using an electoral supermajority, he stacked the country's institutions by modifying the constitution 15 times. He used all of that to enrich his closest political allies, including with EU funds, all the while campaigning against the EU on policies related to immigration, LGBT, and aligning with Russia by blocking EU aid packages to Ukraine, while receiving cheap energy imports. As a result, the EU had effectively sanctioned the country, initially trying to suspend its voting rights under Article 7, and when that didn't work, with it not finding the necessary 26 votes, it instead moved to use the rule of law conditionality mechanism passed in 2021, which suspended funds worth 15% of Hungary's annual GDP.
The conditionality mechanism that deprived Hungary of EU funds due to democratic backsliding and rule of law transgressions, and the bad economic figures that it resulted made it much more difficult for Viktor Orban to persuade the public that they are running good governance.
This deprived Hungary of the means to maintain its expensive patronage system and was a contributing factor in the fall of Viktor Orban. And when Peter Magyar won the 2026 election with a supermajority enabled by Hungary's winner-takes-all electoral system, the EU delivered a list of 27 super milestones that Hungary would need to fulfill to recover the money, which involved restoring the rule of law. But they also pressured Hungary to allow €90 billion loan to Ukraine to go through. As a gesture in that direction, Peter Magyar campaigned to have Hungary join the European Public Prosecutor's Office, to make Hungarian politicians accountable for misspending EU funds. What's more noticeable is that this is an enhanced cooperation agreement that Hungary had initially opted out of. This both threatens Orbán and his followers for misappropriating funds, but also serves as a gesture of good faith towards the EU in hope to unlock the blocked funds. In other words, in the Hungarian case, the EU's carrots and sticks were powerful enough to nudge the country back on track, according to the EU. If the Hungarian case is anything to go by, it seems that the EU can now impose its rules and will on its smallest member states. And measures that were previously optional are slowly being rolled out more widely. It could also mean that a tipping point is nearing where the EU acquires enough power that it starts to snowball and centralization becomes inevitable, even if it might need more time to enforce its rules on its biggest and richest member states. But what do you think? Are we close to that point, or does the EU need more crises and empire creep to strengthen the EU further compared to the capitals before it starts to snowball? Will EU countries which seem headed for nationalist governments in the next 5 years go along with the empire, or will the pushback against it intensify? And if the EU centralizes further, will it also then use its new unity to project power abroad like other empires? These are all questions for future videos, but in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments down below.